Good morning. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you for your ongoing support of the Council Town Hall through your contributions by becoming members and renewing your memberships. The need for our informed, nonpartisan discussions is more critical than ever before. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's program, Confronting Racism, a pandemic within a pandemic, with Michael Lawson, President and CEO of the Los Angeles Urban League, one of LA's oldest nonprofits in its mission to educate and empower African Americans and other minorities to secure economic self-reliance and civil rights. Helen Torres, President and CEO of HOPE, Hispanas Organized for Political Equality. It's a nonprofit who empowers our communities through Latina leadership training and increasing the knowledge on all the contributions Latinas have made to advance women for the past 30 years. Charlie Wu, Board Chair of CAUSE, the Center for Asian Americans United for Self-Empowerment, and moderated by Dan Schnur, politics professor at USC, Pepperdine, and Berkeley. For those of you who are joining us online, we will be taking questions in about 20 minutes. There's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program. It would be terrific if you have a particular panelist that you'd like to answer your question to indicate it when you type in your question. We'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible. Dan, it's time for me to turn it over to you. Thank you.
And thanks to all three of our panelists for joining us here today. And thanks to all of you who've joined us in the audience for this really, really important discussion. I'm very excited to be able to play a part in this because I've had the good fortune of working with Michael Lawson, with Charlie Wu, and with Helen Torres over the last several months, as each of them, in what I would call a visionary way, have come together in what I would call a cross-community coalition, recognizing that in order for Los Angeles to succeed, in order for any of our individual communities to succeed, it needs to be done in a collaborative and cooperative manner. And I've had the good fortune of working with them on a number of projects, and I'm particularly excited to have them here today for part of today's conversation. So as Kim mentioned, I'm going to start out, as per our norm, by asking questions for the first portion of today's program. But as she said also, we'd very much like for you to be part of this conversation as well. And so when Jessica and I do open it up to as many of your questions as possible, we hope you'll see that as an opportunity to play an equally vital role in a discussion about how we collectively can move forward, particularly in the face of such recent, important and challenging recent events. So with that, I'm going to begin the questions, and I'm going to start by going to Michael Lawson, the President and CEO of the Los Angeles Urban League. Michael, as near as I can tell, you have been one of the few busiest people in Los Angeles over the last few weeks. And what may not be as quite as apparent to our audience is you were one of the busiest people in Los Angeles even before the last few weeks. So thank you for taking the time to be part of this conversation. And I guess what I'd like to do, Michael, before we bring Helen and Charlie into the discussion, is to ask the question that I think is on all of our minds. Because many of us as Angelenos and from other parts of the state and the country have seen these kind of conversations start before in the form of protest and otherwise. So I guess my question to you to kick off today, Michael, is we've watched these protests after the first few days proceed in largely a peaceful manner. But what happens next? What happens after those peaceful protests? Why will this conversation be different than the ones that have preceded it over the years and the decades?
Excuse me. Thank you very much, Dan, for that question, and want to thank Town Hall for hosting this, and thank the other panelists as well. The difference that you're seeing is a function of the multiracial cry for the injustice that happened in Minneapolis. This is not the first. This is not the only. This is what you saw there was just something that is repeated in our communities. I won't say daily, but all of us have been through this. And you go back to what happened in 1992 and things that happened before that. And in those situations, you saw only the African American community lashing out, and lashing out in ways that, quite frankly, I think were counterproductive in a number of ways. But I think you have to give credit to Black Lives Matter, because Black Lives Matter is an organization nationwide that has been keeping this issue top of mind in ways that irritated some people and others praised, but they kept it in the front of everybody's attention. And then to add to that, the multiplicity of events that happened almost back to back, and just people who were saying, well, this is just something that doesn't happen often, you're blowing it out of proportion, and so on and so forth. All of a sudden, it became very real. And people began to say, this is not something I'm willing to sit back and just allow to happen. I also have to say that this happening in the middle of a pandemic when everybody was home is one of those critical kind of convergences of events that made this possible. And the fact that people were sheltering at home across the world, watching the news and seeing this over and over again and saying, this is not acceptable. And I really don't have to make a choice between making my anger known and going to work today. And you look at all of those things coming together, and you're beginning to see how many well-meaning, understanding people. I mean, there are out there who are saying quietly in their homes when Rodney King was beaten, this is not acceptable, but I'm not going to go out in the streets and do it. I'll let the civic leaders who have a title in their name, who should be out there doing it, and now quietly support them, but it's on them. They'll have to push the needle. Everybody said, this is unacceptable. I need to do something. I have the time to do something. I have the energy to do something. And I don't want to dismiss the millennials who are out there in droves. And because this is a part of our community that wants to see change and wants to be a part of it. The confluence of all of these things created this perfect storm that allowed us to look at ourselves in the mirror and say, who do we want to be? What do we want our country to be like? And so many people said, I'm not sure exactly what it's going to look like, but I don't want it to look like this. And to me, it's part serendipity, but a lot of it is just people saying enough is enough.
Well, I think, thank you, Michael. Several important points there, but what really leapt out at me more than anything were the two major forces that I think that you correctly identified that have given this conversation such a different character. One, of course, is the pandemic, and there's nothing any of us can do to control that aside from continuing to abide by the social distancing measures that have been asked of us. But the second one, I think, strikes me even more. I think it was the first you mentioned, which is the multifaceted nature of the participation in the protests. and the fact that so many people from so many different backgrounds are joining in this conversation. For those of you who participate in our weekly webinar, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus, on Thursday mornings at 11, you may remember that last week we talked about polling that had been done on the Black Lives Matter organization. And as recently as about 2 years ago, more Americans expressed unfavorable feelings toward the organization than expressed favorable feelings. By the beginning of this year, those numbers had changed slightly, but it's really only been in the last few weeks that the organization has built a base of public support. And I suspect it's for the reasons that you mentioned. And I want to follow up with you on that in just a couple of minutes. But I'm very, very eager to bring Helen Torres into this conversation because, as I mentioned earlier, Helen, we've had the good fortune to work together over the months on a number of fronts, most notably a joint public opinion poll co-sponsored by these three organizations that polled Californians on a statewide basis on issues relating to race relations, to discrimination, and other issues of relevance to each of these communities. Now, Helen, this poll was taken before the recent protests. It was taken before the onset of the pandemic. But even so, it seems to me, and I know you've thought a lot about this, that you believe that that poll provides some valuable insight into how California's communities of color feel about these important issues, even before the seminal events of the last few weeks. Can you talk a little bit about those findings?
Happy to, Dan. And it's wonderful to be on with you, Charlie and Michael, and a big thank you to Kim as well. For those of you, just to put a little bit of context that aren't familiar with HOPE, which stands for Hispanas Organized Political Equality, we are a nonprofit organization that advocates on behalf of Latinas in California and nationally. When we participated in the poll that Dan has just mentioned, the California Community Poll, we looked at participants from the Caucasian, African American, Latinos, and Asian Americans. And I think it's very important to stress that that truly is the makeup of California. And so when looking at this poll, we asked a couple of race relation questions that I think is very pertinent to this conversation. First, we asked individuals that participated in the poll, how were they feeling about race relations when it came to the United States, California, and their local neighborhood? And overwhelmingly, they felt much better, at a 72%, about race relations in their local neighborhoods. Not, okay, about 52% in California, and that dipped quite a bit when they were looking at the nation at 32%. The other question we asked was, did they see improvement? And that was asked from a United States as well as a California lens. And from the United States lens, about 10%, so a very low amount of participants said they saw improvement nationally, where 20% said in California. I'm in agreement, Dan, that this was, even though it was taken in February, it really tells us a couple of things. It communicates, for me, there was a complicit, we were complacent during that time and for a while about race relations. I feel like we've gotten into a little bit of a lull. Weren't paying attention to the voices and the what was happening day to day because we weren't confronting it in our own neighborhoods. In California, like in a lot of places, there's a lot of segregation still. So we have to work on that and we have to get better on that. But it also tells us that overwhelmingly people that were taking this poll did not feel that the United States was going in the right direction when it came to race relations. Remember, 90% said there was no improvement. So there's a lot of work to be done, a lot of work to do coalition building, a lot of work to support Black Lives Matter, and a lot of work to really think about the criminal justice system, the reforms that need to take place, but not just at the criminal justice system, also within our corporations and how we view philanthropy. And I look forward to speaking to that a little bit more.
Right. And let's come back to that in more detail in just a minute or two also. But I think you make a really, really important point here, that particularly here in California, while residents of all ethnic and racial backgrounds are somewhat skeptical about progress on this issue, very skeptical on this issue at the federal level, and slightly more optimistic at the state level, it's really in our own neighborhoods where they see the most cause for encouragement and the most potential for growth and positive movement. And once again, I think it's why a coalition like this one can be so important. And why I'm so encouraged, I must say, to give the audience members a deserved shout out, that the number of you that decided to participate today in this conversation is so impressive and so rewarding. So Charlie, let me ask you about this, because I know you've examined these poll results like Helen and like Michael very, very carefully. One thing that you and I have talked about a lot is that a public opinion poll, any poll, is really just a snapshot in time. It tells you what people thought or what people felt at a particular moment. And I think one of the things we've learned over the course of the last few weeks, and certainly over the course of the pandemic, is how quickly those attitudes can change. And I know for the last few weeks, this conversation has centered, not exclusively, but largely on the African American community. But the Asian Pacific community, particularly during the time of the onset of COVID-19, has faced some very significant challenges as well that you believe may have impacted public opinion. And I'm wondering if you can talk about the speed of change that takes place in response to real events, if you would. So Charlie, do we have
Dan, thank you, World Affairs Council Town Hall, and Kim and Dan for making this possible. And I want to, I want to, before I go into the changing of public opinion poll, I want to, excuse me, I might have a little bit problem here. Can you hear me?
We can.
Oh, okay. So I want to support what Michael and Helen have said, is that the debate would be what next. You know, obviously the front and center issue would be police reform, and then Helen mentioned where that debate, that discussion should occur. And I think although that we hear from Washington D.C. in this couple of days about some of the initiative, but I think either the President Trump's executive order or the Senate Republican version of the reform, the House Democratic version of the reform, they are touching on very basic reforms, more obvious reforms such as banning chokehold, you know, a no-knocks warrant, and maybe a database for bad cops. But I think what the people want is a more fundamental change of culture, attitude by the police and their relationship with the community. And at the federal level, you know, we have a little bit less than 18,000 different law enforcement agencies throughout the country. So that, you know, we don't expect too much from the federal level, except some very basic guidelines on what not to do. But the fundamental change would have to occur in the community that Helen mentioned. So, and when we talk about what kind of reform do we need, I think people are a little bit tired of the word police reform, because we've been talking about reform for more than 50 years. And I think there are people that want to defund the police. They still have a lack of consensus of what that means. And does that mean that we should change some of the police function from, we train them to be law enforcement agents, we train them to, you know, train them with the military tactics in either, you know, control crime, violent criminals, terrorists, and that's a very different than many calls nowadays to the first responder, which would be, a lot of them are domestic disputes, mental illness, substance abuse, or homeless issue. So should police take on a social worker role? If not, then that job should go to the social workers instead of the police. And it was really interesting that in President Trump's executive order, he mentioned about co-responder for the police with social workers. I think that is kind of an interesting suggestion, but how to work that out would have to be depend on the community and design the system that best work for each community. And I think in addition to that, I think the mayor was suggesting that we take some money out of the police budget to do social program to address the social inequity issues. And I have been in this space as chair of the Workforce Development Board for different city administrations. And one of the observation we have is when you look at economic numbers, unemployment numbers, sometimes it's very misleading, right? Right before COVID-19, unemployment was at all-time low. But the poll indicated that our poll indicated that even at that peak, the perception that the economy was really going well in California, the majority of Californians weren't very satisfied with the condition of the economy. And particularly among the young people and women, they are even less positive about the economy. So we need to really look deeper than the numbers and statistics and really look into what are the populations that are marginalized, that are in the margin of the economic system, or even completely left out of the system, so that no matter how good the numbers are, the rising tide doesn't really lift all boats. Some of us are being left behind, and that really is something that we address. And in terms of those that are neglected, that face barriers, if you look at it, some of the population that we have looked at include men from South LA, African American men from South LA, domestic violence survivors, LGBTQ, particularly the transgender community, and their chances of, the barriers they face for job opportunities and economic gain are the barriers are really, really high. So we need to really go beyond the statistics. And that's where the community dialogue comes in, because the government can give out money and look at statistics, but how that is implemented should be require a discussion of groups that have not been in the system before. Let me quickly address your point about how public opinion poll turns. When we did the poll in February, the Asian community felt actually pretty good, despite the fact that they recognized that they face discrimination at work, and they, in terms of career advancement, and there's this various discrimination. But was something that we have accepted. We are very optimistic about the future, that we will be more accepted. And as a matter of fact, that a lot of Asian Americans identify being, they embrace American identity at the highest percentage than all groups. And they also, by the same high percentage, they embrace being Californians. So they take roots in California, embrace American identity, but at the same time, they embrace their own culture and identity. So for many Asian Americans, it's not a choice between being an American or being Asian. And we embrace both, and we're very optimistic that we would eventually be accepted. But then COVID-19 hit. There was false belief that Asian Americans being perceived as foreigners, carry a foreign virus and spread COVID-19 to Americans. So one of the most often abuse that Asian Americans have to take is opening now. We are not talking about quiet discrimination, was go back in a different version of the same phrase, going back to your country, get out of my country. And that is particularly shocking and eye-opening for Asian Americans. For many of us, we recognize discrimination. It was quiet, but we keep our head low, we work hard, we hope that eventually we overcome that. So that was a wake-up call. And then what happened to George Floyd, Rayshard Brooks, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, three of them were on television, on video. We saw what happened. And that's not just an African-American issue or community of color issue. That's a humanity issue. It touched everybody. Asian Americans are not exempted from that brutal reality of racial discrimination. On top of that uneasiness we have felt about COVID-19 and discrimination, and this was clearly a wake-up call. And then that's in a way that's very positive, that this movement is cross-cultural, and it also requires a cross-cultural dialogue, people from different perspectives and viewpoints in terms of police, in terms of racial relations come to the table. And I think that this dialogue today, as well as the poll we did before this, is really such a good example the way forward.
Well, thank you very much, Charlie. And I think you make a really, really important, several important points, but one that really leapt out at me is your use of the phrase, a rising tide lifts all boats. As we all know, when President Kennedy first used that phrase more than half a century ago, he was talking primarily about economic growth and success. And what I take away from at least the first round of questions to you and to Helen and to Michael is thinking that kind of collective fashion is important, not just economically, but on a much broader range of issues as well. Because we do want to get to our audience questions, I'm going to respectfully and unfairly ask our panelists to answer the next round of questions more briefly, and then we will go to your questions in the audience. So if you do have them, please send them to Jessica. So Michael, Helen, Charlie, will all have certainly more time to expand during the audience question portion. But if we can now focus in a little bit on the next round of questions going forward. Michael, Charlie referred to the scope of the discussion about police reform. But the other thing that strikes me is the urgency of this discussion. Even a week ago, the Republican Senate leadership was saying, well, we'll get to this after the 4th of July. By the beginning of this week, seeing the mass movements continuing around the country, they've accelerated their efforts, and it's clear that the same thing is taking place at the state and local level as well around the country. So I'd ask you, and again, in an unfairly limited time frame, as you look at the discussion over police reform, what aspects do you think are most important for us to be focusing on in order to achieve these goals?
I'm not sure that there's any one. These discussions have been going on for some time, even before the Rodney King beating. So the movement has been and continues, and the people who are doing the negotiation are still at the table and have been at the table. So it is not as if people had to all of a sudden think, well, what should we do now? The template has always been there, and the question is, just are people adding, looking at what Black Lives Matter and other organizations have been demanding over the years, going back to 1992 and before then. I'm old enough to remember the riots in the 1960s and the reforms that were demanded then. So these demands are not new. What's new is, as we said earlier, a broader coalition is looking at these demands and saying, yes, these are reasonable. Why aren't we implementing them?
Well, Michael, thank you very much. And we will come back to this in just a few minutes. And my guess is, Jessica, that there are probably more than a couple questions specifically about the defund the police discussion that has arisen. And we'll come back to that as well. But Helen, before we do that, let me come back to you, and I'm going to ask you to come at this from a different perspective. What each of you have talked about a little bit up until now is changing of the law at City Hall, in Sacramento, in Washington, D.C. But in addition to changing law, to legislation, to changes in policy, what are the other necessary steps for us to take in order to move forward?
Thank you, Dan, for that. So I want to also build upon the concept of rising tide lifts all boats. I think it's really important to acknowledge, especially in this conversation, that we all are not on the same boat. Some of us are in paddle boats, some of us are very small canoes, and others are somewhere in a beautiful place in a yacht. So how when we think about the past and some of these sayings, they're not really reflective of how the economy works for all of us. I really appreciate Charlie's statement saying that there was, even going into the pandemic and when we were all suffering from the economic downturn, other communities were already there, or even as they were improving, they weren't improving at the same pace. Case in point, Latinas with the pay wage gap is in communities like in San Jose and Silicon Valley, you're looking at 32 cents per dollar against a white Caucasian male. So the economy is very important in this conversation in every context in which we talk about race. And of course, within this pandemic, within a pandemic. And I think it's important to start off with understanding that we're not all in the same boat. And that's really important for the conversation about what do we do next? What comes after the protest, and what can we do collectively to make that change that dynamic? So a couple of suggestions that I'm putting forward. First of all, I think corporations have a huge role to play in this. We've seen a lot of corporations come up with their public statement, their commitments of dollars. We have yet to see how that's going to be implemented. A couple of suggestions. If you're doing good, then take bigger bets and ensure that your workforce diversity is inclusive of your corporate board as well as your C-suite, and ensure that you do have programs in which you will see African American, Latinas, and Asian Americans on your board. Not tomorrow, not in the next day, but today. Make the governance changes that you have to make that happen. Ensure that you have diversity of thought there. The other thing is when it comes to the spending of dollars, both from corporate philanthropy and private philanthropy, it is amazing to think studies show as recent as in January of this year, less than 1% of philanthropy goes to communities of color-led nonprofits. That's criminal in itself. And when you look at the spend when it comes to African American males, that's even below the 1%. So that needs to be just rectified and needs to be changed quickly. We hear great statements, but we need to see the evidence of that, and we need to be part of that solution. So those are two of the areas, and those will give to societal changes that need to happen. Statements are important. I don't want to minimize them, but they should just be the start. And this is a larger conversation. Michael made reference to this is our opportunity to enforce and put in place reforms that we have known for ages need to happen. So let's keep on top of this. Let's keep the protests going in a peaceful way, in a safe way. But we have to be, as not only civic leaders, but as every citizen and resident of this great United States, be alert that this is our opportunity to do right, to justify past wrongs, and to ensure that we all hopefully get on that big boat to rise all tides eventually.
Wow. Helen, that statistic alone on philanthropic engagement is absolutely extraordinary, and that's something I'd love to come back to you with in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. One thing I will do, though, before I go on to Charlie, is Helen made a really important point about the corporate role in this, and I will make a plug on behalf of her and her extraordinary organization, because one of the things I've always admired about Hope, and one of the things I've always enjoyed most about the work I've been privileged to do with them, is while their organization in its title talks about political equality, their leaders aren't just political and community leaders. They're some of the most impressive Latina business leaders in LA and around the state and around the country involved in the organization, and it really has been one of Hope's strengths over the course of its existence. We're going to come to your questions in just a minute. Before we do, I want to come back to Charlie one more time to give him another chance to weigh in, because one of the things I've always admired most about Cause is its commitment to young leaders, and of course that's a commitment that both Hope and the Urban League share as well. But Charlie, I'm wondering, before we go to audience questions, if you can talk for just a minute about the role that young people can and should be playing in this discussion, and what we can do to make sure their voices are heard in as positive and productive a way as possible.
Thank you, Dan. That's a very important question about the role of young people. Our poll had found that that despite the fact that all of us, different communities of color, feel discrimination, young people and the women feel strong about discrimination. Notice more discrimination than men and older generation. And my assumption is discrimination has been more serious now than the previous generation. But the younger generation are not likely to accept that, not likely to keep quiet. They are more outspoken. And then when you talk about their feeling towards California economy and the future and opportunity that we offer them to different communities of color to advance, although that our generation feel pretty positive about the progress, the gradual progress, young people are not satisfied. with the kind of gradual progress that our generation might have accepted. And then also, in terms of our recent presidential election, it is the issue of, very fundamental change of culture and attitude and systematic changes that the young people want. And they want it now. And for example, the whole lot of issues, the young people are a lot more upfront than our generation. The Green New Deal, the Medicare for all, in terms of free education, universal education, in addition to social economic, restructuring. And young people have a lot of energy to provide. And then we witnessed that in the protests. Our role as organization, particularly dealing with training the younger generation, the civic leader, is how do you channel that outrage into constructive, outcomes? And I submit to you, this is not easy, because our generation that are in the trenches of the political arena notice that politics so often are incremental, that we make progress 2 steps ahead, maybe one step back. Now, but the young people want more fundamental changes. How do we bring that energy into a system? Unless we can change the system, but they have to get into the system first. So our role would be, how do we lead, open the doors for the next generation so that they will have a seat at the table when we have the kind of community discussion about economic policy, police, reform policy, or reimagining public safety. Young people have to be there, but then they have to recognize that things are not going to change overnight that they would like to see. So that is a challenge that we have to face as community leaders and community organizations.
Well, thank you, Charlie. Thank all of you. And we still have about 25 minutes left, which is a little bit less than we normally leave for audience questions. But Jessica, I think you'd agree that the incredibly vital conversation that Charlie and Helen and Michael have led us through to date, to this point in the program, was well worth it. But maybe it's time for me to end my monopoly on this conversation. And maybe if you've gotten any audience questions, I think we'd all be excited to hear what our other participants have to say.
Great. Yes, we have a lot of questions coming in. The first question: what portion of our current problems are driven by a system that facilitates economic inequality?
This is a fascinating question about economic inequality. And Helen, you were correct in your last response to talk about how all boats talks about a wide range of boats. I know when you talked about yachts, you were not making a comment personalized toward David Geffen, but if you'd like to, you can clarify that going forward. But if you can talk a little bit more, because there was really important information in that poll, not just in terms of different racial and ethnic communities, but between genders. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that economic inequality and voters' attitudes toward it.
Absolutely. So Latinas and African American women overwhelmingly in our poll and from our experience at Hope have been very vocal about the inequalities when it comes to the pay, the wage gap. And this is even when Latinas and African American women are at par educationally and the opportunities that they're provided. So when we start discussing race, when we start talking about systematic racism, we also have to understand that it's very much driven by self-interest and very much driven from a lens that it doesn't come from sharing, right? If you go back to kindergarten where we're all learned the good lesson about sharing and being good, that does not come into play in our economic system. It's really about almost a dog-eat-dog world, and sometimes, unfortunately, race and gender are used in that way. What do we do about it? First of all, we've got to start addressing the facts and the truth about it. And then second of all, we have to not only acknowledge that this is an issue, we have to start ensuring that our leaders, both corporate and philanthropy and elected leaders, understand that it's an issue. And that they're not just measuring, and we're as collective society are not just looking at the unemployment rates and what the GDP is for the country, but really measuring, is it inclusive of everyone? Is everyone getting the same opportunities? And that goes even deeper into how we lend money in this country, how we have an educational system that is not built for everyone in this country. So there's a lot of layers here. What I suggest to people, and we talk about this a lot in our leadership programs, is pick an area that you can really thrive, where you're an expert in, so that this doesn't seem so overwhelming. So even when we think about the economy, we're talking at Hope a lot about micro businesses. That's where the majority of Latinas are really thriving. So how do we help them grow their micro businesses into small businesses that hopefully will be large corporations in the future? So as leaders, I think we need to pick a place where we can really make a difference, but hold the whole system accountable. And it does we always say this at Hope, and that's why it's part of our mission to ensure economic and political parity. The two are mixed together. You cannot divorce the two because they drive each other. And people get into politics a lot of times because of the economic necessity.
And Charlie and Michael, I know you have thoughts on this topic as well, but let's move on if we can and make sure that we get in as many audience questions as possible. And then if either or both of you would like to add on to Helen's comments in that context, of course, we'll make sure you have the chance to. So Jessica, what else have we got?
Sure. This questioner says, the source of all racism is the fear of having to compete for employment with Black and Brown people. That is the genesis of all unrest. Excuse me. How is this fear diffused?
That is a very challenging question. And Michael, maybe I can start with you on this, if you're willing to talk about Black-Brown tensions, a perception, accurate or inaccurate, as to these economic challenges being a zero-sum game, and how these communities can begin to work together more cooperatively going forward.
That's a great question, and let me say that the racist cloud that has hovered over this country since its inception is by design, and understand that the tension between those of us who are on the bottom rung, Black, Brown, Asian, is also intentional. That is the base upon which the upper class keep their standing. The New York Times did a great series of articles last year called the 1619 Project, where they basically talked about the 400 years of slavery in this country. And one of the articles talked about the fact that our form of capitalism is a form of capitalism that is based on the slavery model. The keeping minimum wage down as low as possible is the equivalent of keeping a slave type of population in your community. And understand that this model is one that by design keeps poor whites separate from Black and Brown folks. You keep the people on the bottom rung fighting each other, and they can't get together and use their strength to change the model that's in place. You look at schooling. We just passed the 99th anniversary of the Greenwood massacre in Tulsa, where a district in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which was called the Black Wall Street, one of the most economically empowered minority communities in the country, was destroyed. The school books never talked about it. You never hear about it. And so there's no reparations, there's no anything. The number and the redlining that has gone on legally, banks were allowed to ignore Black and Brown folks in terms of access to credit, access to capital. After the redlining was made illegal, it didn't stop in reality. So what you have is an economic model that needs all the folks in all of us who are in that lower quadrant to basically continue to fight against one another instead of coalescing and building a base. The fact is, one of the reasons why communism was vilified in the 50s was because the Communist Party was trying to bring these groups together, and the economic powers that be saw this as a threat. So the economic model that we have is not necessarily doesn't by necessity have to work this way. And you know, the trickle down theory never was, as Helen so eloquently said, the rising tide doesn't lift all boats, especially when you have our boats moored to the bottom of the ocean. I mean, you look at the minimum wage standards, and the difficulty of raising those makes no sense. At the same time, when you look at the fastest economic growth within this country was a function of the New Deal, was a function of using the economic power of the government to fund infrastructure and raise the wages of lower class people. The economy grew by leaps and bounds, because what are we going to do when we get this money? We're going to spend it. And you know, we're going to buy the homes that supercharge the economy of this country. Henry Ford paid his employees wages that were high enough for them to buy the product that they were creating, and you created this huge middle class of people who did not go to college but were making six figures and supercharging that industry. But there's a concerted effort to keep us apart, and we have to, and that's the beauty of the coalition that we're seeing following the murder of George Floyd. The people are coming out and saying, no, we are in this together, and we have to keep this moving and keep this going forward.
Thank you, Michael. We're going to do everything we can. Of course, Charlie.
I know the chime in on. Okay. Actually, I think the question itself assumes that the economic system is a zero-sum game, and but I think that's a rather narrow way to look at it. But I can show you many examples of growth industries in Los Angeles where certain population has not got equal access. Let me give an example. The construction infrastructure development, you know, that the construction workers have largely been Latino male. And it's actually by the Latino labor union leader that create training program to welcome African-American men to join that industry, because African-American men are way underrepresented in one of the biggest industries in Southern California, the construction and infrastructure building industry. And if you look at healthcare, there are many positions that are going to be open, and that would welcome Latino, Asians, or African-American to join that. And when you talk about the Green New Deal, you have entirely new field of construction and clean energy, clean, energy conserving remodeling that would require new skill sets that are open, that are not dominated by one group or another. I think we should look at how to channel, look at the growth industry and where the opportunities are, and direct, because in many industries they need skilled workers, and how to channel that those that are in the margin of economic system be left out, how to direct them into those growth industries. I think that would be the solution.
Well, and I think your last point is a particularly important one, Charlie, and it's something that we've talked about in other LA World Affairs Council town hall programs, that even when we talk about the important benefits of international trade, the importance of worker training and retraining to make sure that as the economy changes, that those who've developed skills for a manufacturing economy don't get left behind in a technology-driven economy. Jessica, I know we're going to try to work in at least a couple more questions. So
It's a business that I am in. the misperception international trade is for international business people, business elites. That's furthest from the truth. The work are being done by warehouse managers, logistic workers, forklift operators, currently the truck driver. Eventually, the truck driver might be in danger now, but those are really prime jobs for minority groups without a lot of sophisticated training.
I couldn't agree with you more. You're exactly right. Jessica, what else do we have?
Sure. The Tax Cuts and Job Acts that passed in 2017 provided federal funding for opportunity zones to serve economically distressed communities. How is the state of California being held accountable to ensure that these funds are allocated to diverse communities and businesses to build and improve these areas?
Well, Michael, I'll come back to you again, if I may, because the concept of opportunity zones is one that's not only been discussed, but attempted to be implemented at both the state and the national level for decades now. Has the concept of opportunity zones, of giving tax credits for companies to locate in underrepresented communities, has it worked effectively? And if not, what can be done to make it a more impactful approach?
Yes, it is a good concept. The devil is always in the details. Each state had the opportunity to identify areas that would be treated as opportunity zones. California did, I think, a very good job of identifying areas that needed it the most. But at the same time, the decision making is in the hands of the opportunity zone fund managers, or the people who are getting the benefit of the tax credit themselves. So you see a decision making that's based more on finances than on the impact on the community itself. So I think there's some flaws there, and also the way it is written, the investors can get the tax break without really having any sort of real change happening in that particular area. So there are,
and of course, we've seen
it is not perfect.
And of course, we've seen, even in this latest round of federal government support throughout the pandemic, the extraordinarily small percentage of loans and grants that have been given to minority-owned businesses over the last few months. So clearly a challenge going forward. Jessica?
Sure. Next question, and this would probably be to Helen and Charlie. I'm going to try to pull two questions in together. How should we educate people in either the Latino community or the Asian community? They're encountering their own challenges. Sometimes they see that that's something that they need to focus on more. How do you communicate with them to care about what's happening with Black Lives Matter and in the African American community?
So, Helen, do you want to go ahead? You run the phenomenally successful HLI program. Maybe you can tell the group a little bit about it.
So a couple of things. I think what's really important is that, being Latina is an ethnicity, and we are of all races, right? So there's an Afro-Latino experience that needs to be very much front and center in these conversations. But I give a lot of credit to our leaders. They can juggle a lot of different things, right? We can be for and ensure that Black Lives Matters is at the forefront of conversations and still protest what's happening at the detention centers at our border. We can ensure that undocumented individuals have fair rights and civil rights here in the United States, and still ensure that the African American male is not prosecuted by a policeman without going through fair process. We can manage both. We can balance both. And that's the message that we talk about at Hope. Leadership is about ensuring that all of us are moving forward together. And that means that we need to manage these very difficult conversations, difficult systems changes together as strong leaders. So I liked what Charlie said about the last question, that it makes some assumptions. The assumption I always move forward is bring it on. We can do better. And we've got to do better. We've got to ask more of our leaders. We can't pick and choose who goes first and how we prioritize this. The fact of the matter is racism affects all of us, and that it's within our families. We have to confront it there, how we raise our children, and it needs to be discussed. And you don't pick one aspect of what's happening with one community over the other. It's all hands on deck. Keep on going with the boat analogy and moving things forward in the right direction.
Thank you, Helen. Charlie, how about you? Cause put so much time and effort into it.
Okay, Dan, let me just support what Helen said. And first of all, we all come from different cultural backgrounds, different, as if we're immigrants, we come from different countries. And we have differences in terms of our perspective. But what we have in common is that we are all Americans. This is our home, this is our future. So, we have to invest in our country, our community together. And it's okay to have, ability to express our different perspectives. But the most important aspect is mutual respect, dialogue, and collaboration. We don't have to agree on every minor detail on every issue, but we have to commit to a common purpose of, together we will be stronger. And because none of us is going home to our home country, wherever we came from. That's not going to happen. So, the best way to go is just to work together.
Well, listen, before we turn this back over to Kim, what I will tell the audience is a couple of things. One, just by looking at our data, this has been one of the most well-attended programs that we've put together over the course of the entire spring since moving to online programming. And what I've also noticed is that there has been virtually no drop-off whatsoever over the course of the hour, which means Helen, which means Michael, which means Charlie, that like me, the rest of the audience would be eager to hear more from you. And so the good news for our audience is if you would like to hear more from our three guests, they'll be appearing this Sunday on KNBC's news conference program with Conan Nolan to talk about several of these issues to a greater extent. And later this summer, we'll be redoing the poll that Helen and Charlie and Michael talked about to reflect changing attitudes as a result of the pandemic, the protests, and hopefully the resulting legislation that comes out of that discussion. And Jessica, not to put you and Kim on the spot, but we'll be excited to bring the three of these guys back to talk about those results once they're available. And for those of you who have not yet had enough of me for 1 week, I'll be here with you tomorrow in my regular scheduled time slot at 11 a.m. on Thursdays for Politics in the Time of the Pandemic. And we'll be talking about the public reaction to the coronavirus. We'll be talking about the state of the economy and its impact on the presidential campaign. And we'll be talking in particular about the impact of female voters in this year's presidential election. So I look forward to joining at least some of you for that conversation back here tomorrow as well. Kim?
Thank you, Dan. Michael, Helen, Charlie, thank you so much for such an important and informative discussion. And personally, thank you all for your strong voices and all your extraordinary efforts on this critical issue. We need you now more than ever. So thank you. And we do want you back. So hopefully get some rest over the next few weeks and we'll come back later. And thank you, Dan, so much for moderating again. I just wanted to highlight some of our upcoming programs. Again, as Dan said, tomorrow, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. He does that every Thursday at 11 a.m. and has a tremendous following. So if you haven't had a chance to watch it, it's really something special. June 30th, we have Dr. Richard Haas, President of the Council on Foreign Relations, moderated by Doyle McManus, from the Washington columnist at the Los Angeles Times. You can check out all of our upcoming programs on the control panel that says handouts on your the panel on the right-hand side of your screen. So please visit our website at lawac.org and register for our upcoming programs. Please, everybody, stay safe, stay informed, and we hope to see you soon. Michael, Helen, Charlie, Dan, thank you so much again. Take care.